Well, welcome everyone. Thanks for coming. And those of you who are here, we're grateful for it. And I'm sure there's many others joining online. We're thankful for them as well. My name is Stephen Collis. I'm a law professor at the law school here at the University of Texas, and I'm the faculty director of the Bech-Loughlin First Amendment Center. I am pleased to welcome Jacob Mchangama here to speak with us about his book that was published last year about the history of free speech, past, present, and future of free speech. And I look forward to just introducing him and turning the mic over to him. He'll give us some remarks. He and I will have a somewhat brief Q&A, and then we'll open it up for any questions folks may have. So Jacob Mchangama is CEO of the think tank Justitia and directs Justitia's Future of Free Speech project. He is also a research professor at Vanderbilt University and a senior fellow at the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression in Washington. He's written and commented extensively on free speech and human rights in international media outlets, really across the globe, every media outlet you can think of, as well as in top-tier academic and peer-reviewed journals. He is the producer and narrator of the podcast Clear and Present Danger, A History of Free Speech, and is the author of the critically acclaimed book Free Speech, A History from Socrates to Social Media, published in 2022. So please join me in welcoming Jacob to the mic. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thanks to those of you who made it. I've been looking forward to this talk. A few hours ago, two Swedish soccer fans were shot and killed in Brussels by what seems to be an ISIS supporter who allegedly justified this killing of innocents on the basis of Quran burnings in Sweden, which the Swedish government has refused to legislate against. This, I think, is one of many fault lines at the global level where free speech comes into play. A conflict that in Scandinavia we thought for a long time was long gone, the lethal relationship between free speech and religion, but is very much with us today. And that is a dramatic way of saying that even though we live in the 21st century, free speech is still a very divisive topic. And in fact, I would argue that we live in a free speech recession globally. But I'd like to start off on a more cheery note. So for a while, since the 1970s really, and up until the early 2000s, there was a lot of positivity about free speech. We lived through what some have called the third wave of democratization, where authoritarian regimes became democratic from Latin America, in Eastern and Central European, the collapse of communism into Africa and so on. And free speech played a crucial role in this development. And a very good example of that is Nelson Mandela, perhaps the most famous, iconic political dissident of human history, who spent some 26 years in prison for opposing white supremacy in South Africa. And shortly before winning the first free and multiracial presidential election in South African history, Nelson Mandela praised the international media for using press freedom, free speech to shine a light on the injustices of apartheid in South Africa. He really painted a picture of free speech having been able to give a voice to those who were oppressed within South Africa. They could go abroad. They could rely on human rights institutions, on the media in the free world to voice the concerns that were being ruthlessly suppressed in South Africa. Because one of the distinguishing features of apartheid South Africa was its ruthless censorship. And so committed was Nelson Mandela to free speech that he said that no single person, no body of opinion, no political or religious doctrine, no party or government can claim to have a monopoly on truth, laws, mores, practices, and prejudices that place constraint on freedom of expression are a disservice to society. And Mandela is really only one of several of iconic dissidents from the era who pointed to the essential nature of free speech for their liberation struggles. Another person we could point to would be Václav Havel, the dissident who founded the Charter 77 movement in the former Czechoslovakia, a poet who was imprisoned and became president of his country as it embarked on democracy after communism. So these were happy days in the 1990s. Free speech would democracy would spread to all of the world, and it would be fueled by free speech. And free speech would have a game-changing trump that would consign traditional censorship to the ash heap of history forever. And I'm talking, of course, about the internet or the World Wide Web, which really became a more of a common phenomenon in the 1990s. And this is a typical embodiment of the spirit of optimism and radical techno-optimism that guided the early days of the internet. John Perry Barlow's Declaration of the Independence of Cyberspace, where he said that we're creating a world where anyone, anywhere may express his or her beliefs, no matter how singular, without fear of being coerced into silence or conformity. In other words, with the spread of the internet, the World Wide Web, it would be impossible for authoritarian regimes to use the old methods of suppression and censorship, because you could buy your modem, your computer, spread information anywhere and share it with anyone beyond the reach of government control. However, things have taken a rather different turn in reality. Rather than continuing the unprecedented march of democracy and the advancement of free speech, things have gone in the opposite direction. So this is a list of the number of journalists imprisoned as documented by the Committee to Protect Journalists. And as you can see, last year was the highest number on record. 363 journalists were imprisoned worldwide, whereas only 92 were imprisoned in 2000. And you can see that the year before that was the second highest, and you see a clear trend towards more and more journalists being imprisoned around the world. So in many ways, governments have not given up. And in fact, the very technology that was supposed to liberate us, i.e. The internet and its offshoots into social media, have been reverse engineered by authoritarian regimes to create high-tech digital surveillance and censorship, with China's Great Firewall the best example, an example of surveillance technology, censorship technology, which is now being exported to many other countries around the world, and which can actually make 1984 look relatively modest with its capability when you integrate AI, for instance, into to these types of mechanisms. So you can see that in many parts of the world, the internet is not free. In Russia, you can't log on to most social media platforms. Its regulators routinely demand that content be removed. India is the world's largest democracy, but in India, the government is increasingly cracking down on the online sphere, basically demanding that if you're a tech platform, you must have a local physical presence, and then putting pressure on employees to remove content based on onerous laws that basically allow the government to say that information that it deems to be fake news must be removed within very short timelines. So the situation around the world is quite depressing compared to what we might have expected in the 1990s or at the turn of the century. One of the interesting aspects is, it's not surprising that authoritarian regimes would do everything in their power to crack down on free speech. If you're a budding dictator, if they were teaching a course at this university on how to become a dictator, the very first lesson would be control the public sphere. Don't allow narratives that challenge your position. That has been true from the very first coup against democracy when the Athenian democracy was overthrown. The very first thing that was done was to crack down on pro-democracy proponents, murder them or exile them. But increasingly in open democracies, we also see that they are contributing to what I call the free speech recession. So I've taken some random examples. You might recognize the picture of French President Emmanuel Macron. So during COVID, there were protests against the lockdown policies. Someone produced a poster of Macron depicting him not so subtly as a Hitler lookalike, and as a way of sort of protesting against what was seen as oppressive policies. Macron sued this person, and this person was ordered to pay 10,000 euros fine for libeling Emmanuel Macron. So that's the head of state, the most powerful man in France. Can he rely on the laws of France to protect him against criticism and dissent for having implemented, whether you agree with them or not, pretty drastic laws restricting freedom of movement of French citizens? In Germany is famous for its restrictions on free speech due to its conception of militant democracy, which posits that in order to fight intolerance, you must be intolerant towards the intolerant. And Germany has been particularly obsessed, I would say, almost with cracking down on the online sphere. So this was a tweet by someone who basically called a local politician a dick on Twitter, and who was raided by the police at 6 o'clock in the morning for such a tweet. Now imagine that every single person who had called, say, Donald Trump similar things in this country or worse on Twitter had to be arrested, were being arrested at 6 a.m. I think a lot of people, maybe some in this room, at least definitely some on this university, would likely have been arrested, and of course would be a flagrant violation of the First Amendment. In Finland, a cartoonist has been arrested for these kinds of cartoons, which are critical of President Erdogan and the theocratic regime in Iran, and for incitement to hatred, which sort of blends the idea of blasphemy and hate speech in a way that is very protective of authoritarian religious regimes. And unfortunately, we also live with this threat that we saw manifest itself earlier today in Europe of those who invoke what I would call the jihadist veto, who insist that certain offensive expressions about Islam should not be tolerated even in an open democracy, and who are willing to kill, as we also saw in 2015 when 12 people were murdered at Charlie Hebdo, this irreverent leftist magazine in France that republished Danish cartoons. So in European democracies, increasingly laws are being used to crack down on free speech. What about the US then? Well, according to FIRE, where I'm a senior fellow, we've seen a great uptick in the number of scholars at universities who are under fire, who are either sanctioned or attempted to be sanctioned for their viewpoint. So you see huge and dramatic upticks. In fact, there are probably a lot more examples of scholars being sanctioned than individuals who were sanctioned during McCarthyism, during the Red Scare, which I think is thought-provoking at least. But it is also true that local governments have started weaponizing free speech, or state governments, especially in Republican states, including Tennessee, where I live, and also at least at the local level here in Texas, to crack down on what is seen as wokeism or progressive policies. So judges have ordered that book removals in Llano County here in Texas violated the First Amendment. In Florida, Ron DeSantis's anti-woke laws have been held unconstitutional, and the same in my state of Tennessee, where a drag ban was held as violating the First Amendment. So that shows you that there is definitely an appetite for restricting free speech in this country as well, both at the cultural level, but also at the government level. And this, even though the polarization of this country means that those who want to, those on the progressive side and those on the conservative side want to ban very different things. And this is what I call Milton's curse. Named after the famous English writer and poet called John Milton, who wrote a fascinating and eloquent defense of free speech called the Areopagitica as a protest against the reintroduction of pre-publication censorship in England. But when you read Milton's treatise more carefully, you find that he is only really in favor of free speech from mainline Protestant sects, not Catholics, not Protestant sects that are too radical, certainly not those who are overly critical of the government. And the ultimate irony, of course, is that Milton ends up serving as a censor under the military dictatorship of Cromwell. And we see many examples of this throughout history, that champions of free speech come to have sort of very selective understanding of free speech and are willing to compromise when their own ideas come under attack. We see this playing out in the U.S. as well. Another phenomenon that I think is relevant to understanding the free speech recession is what I call elite panic. So here's two quotes from former President Barack Obama. The first, when he was a junior senator from Illinois, and he talked about the internet being a neutral platform that allowed him to say what he wanted without censorship. And of course, Obama, more effectively than any other person, used the internet and social media to energize younger voters, to connect with voters who were turned off by traditional politics, to circumvent the traditional gatekeepers in his party so that he could launch a successful presidential bid. But after the 2020 election, Obama comes out and says, well, right now, I think online disinformation is the single biggest threat to our democracy. So the very platforms that helped him become president, he now saw as a threat. And this is not a new phenomenon. Elite panic has been with us ever since the birth of free speech. And I track that to the Athenian democracy some 2,500 years ago, which had two overlapping concepts of free speech. One of them being isogoria, meaning equality of speech. So every freeborn male citizen in Athens had a voice in its direct democracy. They could speak and vote directly on the laws and matters that affected the polity. It was radically egalitarian for its time, not for our time. Women were not included, and freeborn male citizens constituted maybe 20%, and there were slaves and others who did not enjoy these rights. But they also had another concept called parousia, meaning uninhibited speech, which it extended also to foreigners. So Aristotle is a foreigner who set up shop in Athens and could teach doctrines, philosophize in ways that were deeply critical of democracy. So it was basically a commitment to a civic commitment to the tolerance of social dissent. Of course, it was not absolute, as Socrates would find out, but we have to remember that Socrates in many ways was an exception, and that he had been accosting his citizens for decades before he was tried and ultimately executed, and that there were very specific circumstances, including the fact that he was friends with some of the most prominent members of the oligarchic factions that had been behind the coups that overthrew the Athenian democracy. Now contrast the Athenian democracy with the Roman Republic. So the Roman Republic also had a representative government. It treasured free speech, but unlike the Greeks, they didn't have a specific concept of free speech. It was part of the larger freedom called libertas, but if you were in a Roman assembly, ordinary citizens did not have a right to speak. They were addressed by magistrates. You didn't have a right. And so free speech was seen as a value best exercised by the senatorial elite, the well-educated, the wealthy, not the unwashed mob who were seen as too fickle, ignorant to be given a voice in public affairs. And ever since, you've had this tension between egalitarian and elitist conception of free speech. And every time the public sphere is expanded to new and previously marginalized voices, whether through technological developments, through expanding democracy, for instance, to racial, religious minorities, to women, the institutional gatekeepers fret about the consequences. You know, everything we believe in will come crashing down if the Catholics are given a voice, in the words of Milton, or if the poor, and so on. And you see some great examples of this through history. So Erasmus of Rotterdam is one of the most proficient authors, Renaissance authors, who published more than anyone. But in 1525, he said that printers fill the world with pamphlets and books that are foolish, ignorant, malignant, libelous, mad, impious, and subversive. So one of the most productive writers of his time thought that now there are simply too many books and pamphlets being written. And of course, the reason he wrote this was because this was at a time where Martin Luther had gone on the offensive with his Reformation and who relied on the printing press to spread his deeply subversive message that upended all religious and political authority in Europe, and we're still living with the consequences of the Reformation. You know, I live in Tennessee, and when I go on my commute to work, I pass around what seems like 200 different churches, and that whole alphabet soup of different churches and denominations, maybe they wouldn't have been there without the printing press that could have spread that spread the Reformation. Or, you know, fast forward to 1858. This is the New York Times opining on the consequences of the transatlantic telegraph. Well, it has, they claim, caused vast injury on the morals of the people because it is superficial, sudden, unsifted, too fast for the truth, the telegraph. So, you know, why do you need information and news to travel between continents in a matter of minutes when you just have to wait 2 or 3 weeks? You know, what's the need? What's the need for that? Surely we don't need to speed up things so much. And, you know, take out the telegraph, insert social media, and you basically have what a lot of people are fretting about today. But of course, elite panic is not always without reason. Free speech does come with harms and costs. Free speech or words can lead to real bad life outcomes. So without social media, it's difficult to imagine the events on January 6th playing out the way they did. It's quite clear that words, messages that went viral, were spread on various platforms, played a decisive role in motivating a number of people from not only protesting what they perceive to be an unfair election, to actually seek to violently disrupt the peaceful transfer of power in this country, which is a pretty big step and obviously dangerous. So if we acknowledge that free speech comes with harms and costs, maybe then we should just limit certain types of speech. We can all agree that free speech is important, but we don't have to make exceptions as wide as Milton. Maybe we should crack down on the truly dangerous types of speech. And this is where we get into, for instance, the most typical European justifications for limiting free speech, which is the argument that the Nazis gained power through democratic means. They never obtained an outright majority, but they came to power through democratic procedure, and therefore the lesson of that is that you have to crack down on totalitarian, hateful movements before they gain power. This is what I argue is the Weimar fallacy, because if you look at the history of the Weimar Republic, it actually had a lot of free speech restrictions and allowed a lot of censorship. Hitler was banned from speaking in several German states for a long time. In my opinion, the real problem with the Weimar fallacy was that it was too lenient on violence, political violence, whereas it cracked down on a lot of speech. Someone like Hitler, after his putsch in 1923, should obviously never have been let out of prison and be allowed to run again. But he was let out, and they used censorship. Now, there were laws that allowed German states to ban newspapers administratively if they spread false information, if they attacked government officials, and Nazi newspapers were frequently banned. Joseph Goebbels, who would later become propaganda minister, proudly proclaimed that his newspaper, Der Angriff, or The Attack, was the most frequently censored daily newspaper in Germany. So they used it for propaganda purposes. Julius Streicher, the most infamous anti-Semite, probably in Nazi, and that says a lot, and who was executed for incitement to genocide at the Nuremberg trial, ran Das Stürmer, a ferociously anti-Semitic newspaper, was convicted twice for his attacks on Judaism, which was really a thinly veiled attack on Jews, but was carried out in procession from the courtroom. And in Nuremberg, a stronghold of the Nazis, less than a year after he was convicted, the Nazis gained a resounding victory. But the biggest danger of the approach of the Weimar Republic was that it put in place increasingly draconian emergency laws that were supposed to safeguard democracy against communists and Nazis. And they were probably more concerned about the communists than the Nazis, and they were certainly tougher on communists than they were on Nazis in the courts. Article 48 of the Constitution of the Weimar Republic allowed the president to suspend all civil liberties in an emergency procedure. And what happened was that the Reichstag, the parliamentary building, was set on fire, and Hitler, as chancellor, pushed the president to suspend all civil liberties, and therefore he basically used the very provision that was supposed to protect democracy to suspend it. So with that, basically all political opposition could be banned, and within a 6-month period or so, the Nazis had created a one-party totalitarian state that could, to a very large degree, rely on legal precedents established in the Weimar Republic to crack down on dissent before entrenching its own Nazi-style laws that went much further and did nothing, had no resemblance with democracy. Okay, what about racism in this country? We saw we've seen on a number of occasions white supremacy resurface, and obviously, just as Germany has its history of anti-Semitism, there is a brutal history of racial injustice and oppression in this country. And so, based on that, you might argue that just as because of this history, there should be limits on what can be said about racial minorities. That free speech entrenches unequal power relations, becomes a weapon against traditionally oppressed and marginalized groups. Well, again, I think that history is a good lens to view this through. Again, I want to acknowledge that free speech can cause harms. And especially if you are a minority group, certain words can certainly hurt, make you more uncomfortable, unsafe than if you're from another group. But the question here that I'm concerned with is free speech more likely to act as a shield for you or as a weapon against you? And I would suggest that the history of this country actually shows that free speech has been maybe the most powerful engine of human equality that this country has stumbled upon, maybe our entire species. Let me go back to the 1830s. So in the 1830s, abolitionists in the North start a campaign aimed at the South. So they sent pamphlets, literature, arguing for the abolition of slavery. And what happens is that Southern states adopt the most draconian speech restrictions in the history of this country. So you have the death penalty in places like Alabama and Georgia for spreading abolitionist ideas. I don't know that they were ever enforced, but there are certainly examples of people being imprisoned for spreading abolitionist ideas. And Virginia is my favorite example of a state. You know, Virginia had in 1776, even before the Declaration of Independence, Virginia adopted its famous Declaration, Bill of Rights, which said that free speech was the bulwark of liberty. It was lifted from Cato's letters from 1720, which went viral in the colonies and really was an underlying principle that was used to great effect in rallying the troops against the British. And so Virginia, and it was of course also the home of Madison and Jefferson, who were against the Sedition Act that was adopted in 1798. But in 1836, Virginia's General Assembly adopts a law which says that any member of an anti-slavery society who shall come into the state and shall here maintain by speaking or writing that the owners of slaves have no property in the same, or advocate or advise the abolition of slavery, shall be deemed guilty of a high misdemeanor. So you could go to prison for 6 months for stating that slavery, that basically a white slave owner did not have a right of property in his black enslaved human beings. And this is only like an excerpt from a very comprehensive law that basically tried to ban all kinds of abolitionist speech. Now contrast this with my favorite American of all time, Frederick Douglass, who probably more than anyone else has shown how to use free speech to great effect. Now, Frederick Douglass had earlier had said that the right of speech is a very precious one, especially to the oppressed. But my favorite moment is in 1860. Frederick Douglass is at the Tremont Temple in Boston. He's about to give a speech at an abolitionist rally, but the abolitionist rally is violently disrupted by white Bostonians, a lot of them wealthy Bostonians who fear their commercial interest in the South and the disintegration of the Union if you have these radical rabble-rousers. It's important to remember that even in the North at this time, even among those who were opposed to slavery, abolitionists were seen as extremists, like radicals who generally did not have a lot of sympathy. And it was, you know, Douglass traveled all over the country, those parts where he could do so safely, and it was routine for him to meet the slavers' veto, so that people who would violently try to disrupt him or drown him out in various ways. But Douglass responds a week later by penning a speech which is called A Plea for Free Speech in Boston, and I urge all of you to read it because it still is as relevant as ever. It addresses all the major controversies, both government and private threats to free speech. And among the things he says is that a man's right to speak does not depend upon where he was born, upon his color. The simple quality of manhood is the solid basis of the right, and there let it rest forever. So Frederick Douglass has a universalist understanding of free speech. And he really sees free speech. He also says that if there was free speech in the South, slavery would be impossible. And the very reason why the Southern states are so insistent on using censorship and suppression is because the Southerners know this. If you educate the enslaved, if you allow people to criticize slavery, there's no way you can uphold such an inherently unjust institution in a country founded upon ideals of equality and natural rights of the individual. And the Southerners know this. They cannot win a free and open debate on this. Therefore, they have to resort to brutal suppression and censorship. Of course, the abolition of slavery did not end racial injustice. And Southern states Jim Crow laws and so on were a fact for a very long time. But the civil rights movement played a crucial role in fighting back against this. And it's a little known fact that a lot of the major landmark decisions that expanded the First Amendment protections to the extent that the First Amendment today provides the strongest legal protection of political speech of any nation throughout history is due to cases won by the civil rights movement. And John Lewis, who was arrested many, many times, including for protesting in Dallas with a sign that said "One man, one vote," said that without freedom of speech and the right to dissent, the civil rights movement would have been a bird without wings. And for me, that's a very, very important principle to hold in mind, because what does this tell us? It tells us that if you're a minority and you argue for restrictions on free speech, you're only ever a political majority away from being the target rather than the beneficiary of those laws. And when we think about it, can you name a single group that has been oppressed, targeted, discriminated against in open democracies that has not relied on speech to advance its cause? Think about, say, same-sex marriage. Huge triumph, but one that was won to a large extent on arguments, on activism. The rights of women. Go back to 1919, and you have women protesting outside the White House, burning in effigy Woodrow Wilson as a protest against his delivery on and they were arrested. Women did not have political office. They did not possess the economic strength. They did not have weapons. They did not have the physical strength to do away with systematic discrimination. So they had to fight using the public forum, shining the light on the American justice. Okay, you have a democracy, everyone is equal. Oh, by the way, half the population is not allowed to have a vote. So again, it would be very, very difficult to imagine the huge triumphs for the rights of women without free speech. And you can go on and on about traditionally disenfranchised, marginalized groups that have relied on free speech to better their cause. And by the way, this is not only true in this country. I mentioned Nelson Mandela, but also when it comes to fighting against colonialism. This man here, Mahatma Gandhi, was in prison for sedition under laws for 6 years, and he gave a great speech where he said that basically at a time where in this country, if you protested American involvement in World War I, you could go to prison for 10 years. At that time, Gandhi was prosecuted, and he said that, short of inciting to violence, you should be free to criticize anyone and any system. And this was certainly not something that the British were in agreement with. So all of this to say, this very sort of short, non-exhaustive overview of free speech, that in my opinion, free speech is the most fundamental freedom in a democracy. So you might counter and say, well, surely it's worse to be tortured than to be silent. And I would agree when you put it like that. But where are you most likely to be tortured? In a country without free speech or in one with would the systematic and egregious violations of autonomy, for instance, would they have been discovered, stopped without a code press that could shine a light on them? Or the government have been able to shut that down and say, hey, you can't publish our stories, you can publish our stories, you bring it. And also, another thing is, most of the people who are being tortured are being tortured because they say things that governments don't like. So if you respect free speech, you have very little reason. But basically, any other agenda that you feel strongly for, if you're passionate about the environment, about opposing climate change? What's your most active, valuable tool? How are you going to convince people that you're right? You use speech, right? You write stuff, you publish stuff, you petition your politicians, you protest. And that is true about any subject. So, at least if you're committed to democratic, peaceful change of affairs, free speech is your most important tool. In fact, free speech, I would say, is the antithesis of violence and really the precondition for coexistence in a society where people who have very different ideas about philosophy, religion, politics can live together and be colleagues, neighbors, lovers, friends, spouses, and solve their differences peacefully. So in many ways, I would say you need radical free speech to be pragmatic about solving daily lives matters. And that's why I think we need to do everything in our power to reverse the free speech recession. So how do we do that? Well, I believe that the First Amendment you're very lucky to live under the shield of the First Amendment. But as I mentioned, the First Amendment has not always been interpreted in the way that it is now. It has excluded black people. It has excluded political speech, protests against government action. And so ultimately, I think you need to go back to this Athenian ideal of parousia, a civic commitment to the tolerance of social dissent, a culture of free speech, or as George Orwell said it, if large numbers are interested in freedom of speech, there will be freedom of speech, even if the law forbids it. If public opinion is sluggish, inconvenient minorities will be persecuted, even if laws exist to protect them. Thank you very much.
So we'll use these mics. I'm going to ask one quick follow-up question, and then we'll open it up, and anyone in the room can ask follow-up questions as well. And you're going to have to tell me. Good. Is that good?
All right, thanks.
So, Jakob, let me, you know that I generally agree with you as a normative matter about the importance of the robustness of free speech. So let me play devil's advocate.
Yeah.
One of the strongest arguments I hear, first of all, I've never heard anyone who says they're opposed to free speech. Yeah. Right? It's all, the devil's always in the details and how people are actually wanting to apply the laws. The strongest arguments I hear about free speech from the political left in the United States today, it goes back to one of your slides and your topics about the importance of equality, right? And what they'll argue is that all of the examples in history were of minority groups who were oppressed using free speech to try to protect their rights and get some semblance of equality in society. And then they'll say, but the fight is not over. They still feel like those groups are minority groups who are oppressed, who are struggling, and they're still trying to pass things like anti-discrimination laws to put themselves in a position of at least some semblance of equality with the dominant groups in society. And those dominant groups are now using the First Amendment, and in particular free speech, to try to weaponize it to prevent that progress from happening. That's the argument they'll make. Yeah. So they'll argue that, yes, it's true, minorities needed free speech in the past, but now we cannot allow those who are in power to weaponize the concept of free speech to try to prevent progress towards equality. Yeah. How would you respond to that argument?
Well, I'd say, okay, so are you fine with the this group of concerned parents in Llano County, Texas, who appointed themselves grand inquisitors of library books at a public library and expunged books that dealt with LGBT stories, and also I think one of the books was a book on the Ku Klux Klan that was removed. That was based on the concept of viewpoint discrimination, right? A public body can't decide on behalf of citizens what they can and cannot read. You could say the same. Okay, are you then fine with the state legislature in Tennessee adopting a law against drag performances in public, a not so thinly veiled attack on LGBT community? Are you fine with Governor DeSantis's agenda, anti-woke agenda, which is, red meat, culture war stuff, specifically designed to go after progressive agendas? If your answer is no, but, then, I would ask you, well, how will you ensure that, if you move away from a principled, robust protection of free speech, how will you ensure, especially in a country as diverse as this, that they will not be used to counter the very agendas that you care about, short of ensuring absolute political power for yourself? And then I would go to history. Like, Christianity starts out as a weird, persecuted Jewish sect, and Christians are on off prosecuted in the Roman Empire. But when they become the state religion of the Roman Empire, Christians vehemently persecute not only pagans, but each other. So this idea that because you're a traditionally persecuted group does not mean that you don't need to adhere to principles, because those who are persecuted can easily become the persecutors. Another example of this is, socialists and communists, vehemently persecuted throughout Europe from the late 19th century into the early 20th century. But what happens when Lenin establishes the dictatorship of the proletariat? The very first decree they pass is one that does away with free speech. Stalin was sentenced to 7 exiles in Siberia. Didn't make him very tolerant. So obviously, those who say they represent the oppressed, who say, well, we need to be able to determine the limits of free speech in order to further those noble goals, should not be given absolute powers to do so, because there's a very good likelihood that they will abuse them for their own ends.
And we see this in some scholarship. It talks about, hate speech laws meant to protect the oppressed inevitably ended up being used to oppress the very people they were meant to protect.
Sure. I think the strongest argument in favor of hate speech laws is a very pragmatic one. It's one that says, sure, there are inherent problems in defining and enforcing laws against hate speech in a consistent manner. There will always be these, cases where you can argue, oh, this is going too far. But on the other hand, they are on the books in all European democracies, and they haven't turned into totalitarian dictatorships. You might not like the kinds of speech they punish in Germany and France, but by most standards, everyone would agree that these are pretty well-functioning democracies where power changes through peaceful means, where you can criticize the government, can't say everything you want about Macron, but you can still criticize him. So I think that's the most sort of persuasive argument, a very pragmatic one. I ultimately don't think it's compelling, but I can see some merit in that.
Sure. Okay, great. Why don't we open it up for anyone who has a question? And yes, Sammy, I think we've got a mic runner, so hold on so the video picks up.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks so much for a wonderful presentation. So my question is in relation to the way that you frame the issue of free speech. So for example, in all of the history that you narrate, free speech is highly contingent on a kind of politics that make it possible. So for example, when I search the kind of universalist understanding of free speech in Europe, Middle East and beyond, it seems to me that this is still contingent on the kind of politics that it make it possible in Europe with all of its issues and problems, or the United States, for example, as we can see. So free speech cannot be asserted as a universal principle that can be applicable without exceptions or serious qualifications, for example. I'm going to stop here. Thank you.
Yeah, no, of course. And I think, as I also delve into in the book, this idea that when the First Amendment was ratified, America enjoyed free speech and everything was a happy fairy tale. No, the history of this country shows that it was not so. It was contested. It's still contested. And there are serious obstacles to the implementation of free speech around the world. I still, though, think it's, so basically you could say there are a lot of countries. Okay, let me start somewhere else. In 2021, my organization did a survey of attitudes towards free speech in 33 countries around the world. I think over 80% of people around the world support free speech in the abstract, but when you ask them about free speech and supposedly conflicting values, you see huge regional, geographical, cultural differences in what is accepted. But I would still say that you find pockets in all cultures and countries, you find pockets of people who recognize and fight for free speech. So Egypt is an example where I've been lucky enough to work with some extremely brave people who pay a very, very high price for speaking out. Whether it's the current or the Mubarak government, or people being killed for speaking by Islamists for speaking out in ways that are deemed blasphemous to Islam. Certainly there are huge cultural, political, practical obstacles to free speech, and it is also inevitable that free speech, you can't just have the First Amendment and say this precise conception of free speech as understood under the First Amendment should govern everywhere else in the world. But you can still have some basic principles of free speech that I think are without which the idea of free speech becomes meaningless as ideals.
Just very quickly. So when you say that, that's, for example, women gathering in front of the White House, for example, for arguing for women's rights based on arguments. So the counter argument is that arguments will not win you rights. They can assert certain positions, but that requires certain kind of politics behind it, meaning contestation in social political sphere, allowing women hopefully a role in society, politically otherwise. And that takes time, unfortunately.
Sure. I mean, I'm not saying it's not a magical principle that once you reach a critical mass of people, everything will be good. Free speech is also an experiment. There's no guarantee that there's no guarantee that the First Amendment in this country will not result one day in someone coming to power through democratic means and turning this into an authoritarian state. There's no guarantee yet. I think that the First Amendment is a better bet against that. Even if an authoritarian comes into power, I think the First Amendment raises formidable barriers against that person doing the same thing that a Stalin or a Hitler or Mussolini was able to do. But there's no guarantee. It's an experiment, and I think it's been a benign experiment, but it's certainly not, a guarantee to peaceful coexistence.
Any other questions? Yes, in the back.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I wanted to ask about Missouri versus Biden.
Yeah.
It seems to me the greatest threat right now to freedom of speech in the United States involves the government censoring by way of private actors like the social media companies. And at the moment, only the courts deciding that case and Elon Musk are our defense for freedom of speech. So I wanted to see if you perceive things similarly, and in particular to talk about that kind of, you might say, indirect censorship of government pressuring private companies to censor people on those platforms.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. Sort of what is often called jawboning, where, for instance, federal agencies will put pressure on Facebook to remove what they perceive to be mis or disinformation related to COVID and so on. And in Missouri v. Biden, I think it was the White House, the CDC, the FBI, where the court said that they had gone beyond what was permissible under the First Amendment. I think it's still sort of in the flux, this area of law. I'm not a First Amendment scholar, so I'll defer to your expertise on this. But it's an area, as I understand it, where we don't have a lot of guiding principles yet. It's case law that will be developed over time, and basically relying on sort of cases from the analog world. But I with the sort of and there are also sort of concerns about whether the court got all the facts right in the case. But the basic tenor of it, I actually like. I think it's absolutely the case that when governments lean on these platforms, when it's not just sort of, I think government should be able to, should have the right to voice their concerns. Say, this information on your platform we think is misinformation. But when they do it in a manner where they sort of overtly, or where it's understood that if they don't do it, they might suffer consequences. They might threaten legislation. We might change Section 230. I think that should raise First Amendment concerns. You can contrast it with Europe, where the European Union adopted the Digital Services Act, which obliges platforms to remove illegal content after a notice and action system, but also gives the European Commission, a political body, powers to act as a regulator when it comes to even harmful but not, what we might call awful but lawful speech. So that this can be disinformation. So you might have seen a French commissioner called Thierry Breton, who sent letters to Meta, Twitter, or X, TikTok, and so on, saying, hey, there's all this crap floating around on your platforms related to the Israel-Palestine conflict. Please remove it because we've just adopted this Digital Services Act, and if you don't do it, you can be fined up to 66% of your global turnover. So how does that incentivize? Of course, you're going to take down a lot. You're going to err on the side of removal. That would not be possible under the First Amendment. I think that's right. And you see even worse developments in Brazil and India, two critical democracies outside of the traditional West. So I think there's more to do for U.S. courts to develop this body of jurisprudence, but I like the basic principles of that decision.
So Sandra, how are we doing on time? We have time for maybe one more question right here. Yep.
Thank you. I'll try to make it fast then. Multiple quotes that you had regarded freedom of speech with also truth. And you talked about disinformation, which to me sounds like lies, and not just like a difference of opinion or political opinion or anything, but just like an intent to disinform the public. Yeah. So how much protection should something that could critically harm people really be given?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, and I understand the intuitive appeal of prohibiting or criminalizing disinformation or lies. The problem with that, as Madison well understood when he criticized the Sedition Act, is that you very, very quickly get into where, what is opinion, what is fact. And also in a polarized society, as I think most would argue that the US is, do you think if you had a Trump administration and a Biden administration, would they apply the same standard of truth to disinformation if they were given the same powers as the European Commission is over social media, for instance? I think that is highly unlikely. I think they would use it for partisan ends. But I think the real criticism is more sort of a free speech naivety that says, and this is why I'm not a big fan of the marketplace of ideas justification of free speech. I think it has some merit, but I certainly don't think it's the strongest justification. So I think free speech does not necessarily automatically or magically lead to the truth winning out. But I still think it's an indispensable tool for discovering truth. Like, what's your best way of countering or finding out that something is false? Well, that's through speech. Your counterexamples, your rebuttals might not necessarily convince those who have drunk the Kool-Aid from the big lie conspiracy, because they're so emotionally invested in that particular narrative. But you shouldn't forget the critical mass of people in this country who are not sort of heavily, on either side, and who actually are open to various shades of information that don't necessarily conform with that. And I think, so I still think that it's really important not to empower the government to legislate between what is true and false. And also, every single dictatorship that I've encountered have adopted laws against disinformation. In fact, you could say the earliest forms of disinformation laws are heresy laws, right? So the Catholic Church, there's only one true version of Christianity, and we possess it. Everyone else, you might be the most pious Christian in the world, but if you believe in Christianity in the wrong way, you're peddling dangerous misinformation that will endanger not only your own soul's mortality, but that of entire Christendom. You will contaminate it with your falsehood and your lies, and God will punish us. And that precedent, I think, is a dangerous one to follow in an open democracy. And I think there's a lot we can do using free speech to counter disinformation. Like my institute, we're working with these toolkits, AI-powered toolkits, to counter hate speech and disinformation. So these are sort of creative ways where you don't just rely on abstract principles that free speech advocates do too often, but try to come up with practical tools to say, hey, free speech actually empowers us. We can do something about our concerns, our legitimate concerns about the dark sides of free speech.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Thank you. Help me thank Jakob for coming here today, and we really appreciate your comments.